Hello everyone, welcome to my talk. My name is Ping Zhang. I am a third-year PhD student in seismology working with Meghan at Australian National University. In this talk, I will share our recent seismic observations that support the subduction of Australian continent beneath the Timor Islands and the Banda Arc collision zone. Upon that, we also investigate the small-scale structure heterogeneities and try to tie them with the oblique plate convergence and the incoming plate structure heterogeneity.
Here is a regional map of the Southeast Asia showing the Indo-Australian plate is subducting beneath the Eurasian plate, which forms a 1,000 kilometers long active volcanic arc in the middle. As the Australian continent has been moving towards to the northeast, its leading edge arrives at the trench at about 5 years ago and started to interact with the original volcanic arc afterward. And that leads to the present day arc-continent collision in the Banda Arc region. And the place that is outlined by this yellow rectangular box is the focused study region in the rest of my talk. In this zoom-in map, there are 2 major units are included: the red inner arcs that has many active volcanoes, and the yellow outer arcs that represents the collisional orogenic islands between the inner arc and the incoming Australian plate. Then there are several major islands are included in the region. Along the inner arcs from west to east, there are Flores, Arlo, and Vathar Islands. And along the outer arcs, there are Sumba, Sawu, and Timor Island. And then the 4-arc basin in the middle is the Sawu Sea. And in this region, whether the Australian plate is subducted beneath the collision zone is a long-standing debate. Now let's take a look at some important existing evidence. For example, based on geochemistry study along the inner arcs, they found the arc volcanism contamination in East Flores. And there is a extinct arc extinction sectors close to Vathar and Arlo Islands. And they both suggest the involvement of continental materials at deep depths. Then based on geology studies, they found the accreted lithology on Timor Island is very similar to the Australian shelf sequence. Therefore, both geochemistry and geology results support the subduction of Australian continent margin. However, they are surface observations or confined to very small areas onshore. Therefore, we still need deep structure across the entire region to address whether the subduction of Australian continent margin is observable at deep depths. Utilizing seismic tomography, there is published model that interprets the continuous high velocity anomaly from Australian to Banda Sea as the evidence that supports deep subduction of the Australian continent. However, most existing models are at quite large scale and in deep mantle depth range, and they have relatively poor resolution because lack of dense data coverage in the collision zone. Therefore, crustal structure that is important to address whether the subduction is observable in crustal depth range, and if so, what are its detailed lateral extents are still missing. And that is the existing gap we are trying to bridge in this study. Before I dive in our results, I will introduce a bit more background about the incoming plates configuration. On the left, in this plot, it shows the East Gondwana interior rift. And this rifting leads to the formation of a jagged edge ocean continent boundary present in the offshore Western Australian currently. And it includes a system of silence and in-base, which define a structure very heterogeneous Australian continent margin here. Now let's zoom in the Exmouth Plateau and check its more detailed structure. In particular, I want to point out that the Exmouth Plateau is considered to resemble very similar pre-collisional structure of the Timor Plateau. Here on the left plot, it is obvious that the structure is very heterogeneous for the Exmouth Plateau, and from west to east, its compositions transfers from oceanic to volcanic margin and then to the continental materials. Therefore, the Australian continent margin presents structural variations in both margin parallel and perpendicular direction. And with all this background in mind, now let's take a look at how we address the subduction of Australian continent margin debate by imaging the deep structure using seismology. Here is a new seismic experiment that was carried out in the Banda Arc region. It includes 30 broadband seismic stations and covers the major islands of Sumba, Sawu, Roti, Timor, and Flores and Arlo Islands. And using this data set, we applied 3 complementing seismic imaging methods. It includes ambient noise tomography, teleseismic P-wave receiver function, and P-wave code-out correlation. For the first part, we use ambient noise tomography to resolve a 3D VS model in the crust and uppermost mantle. On the left, the shown crustal image is a horizontal slide at depths of 25 kilometers through our model. In the brownish color represents low velocity anomaly, and bluish color represents high velocity anomaly. In order to aid our final interpretations on those crustal images, we particularly select 4 stations on Timor Islands and applied the P-wave receiver function and code-out correlation techniques to resolve the moho discontinuity underneath these stations. This is a simple cartoon illustrate the principles for these 2 methods. Basically, they isolate the convergence and reflections generated from the targeting moho discontinuity, and then in practice, by identification of different phases, we are able to get their delay times, which can be directly mapped into depths in the next step. Now let's focus on the main observations on different crustal images at first. These 4 slides are at depths of 5, 15, 25, and 35 kilometers. And the main features we capture here is the across arc structural variations. Timor and outer arc islands are largely characterized by low velocity anomaly, while the fore arc basin and the inner arcs are characterized by high velocity anomalies. If we draw some vertical profiles across the inner and outer arcs, here on the left in this profile from the northwest to southeast, we can observe these across arc structural variations more clearly. And combining with existing geology observations beneath Timor, we interpret these slow materials as duplexing and subduction of the sediment units and continental materials from the incoming Australian plates. Therefore, we suggest that such across-arc structural variations in the crust reveal the collision of the Australian continent margin with the Banda Arc terrain. Next, we will move our focus on the structure beneath Timor at deeper depth range, around 30 to 40 kilometers. And let's take a look at the moho structure beneath the red and blue stations. In these slides on the right, the top are receiver function results and the bottom are autocorrelation results. Here, we can easily identify the different phases from, that generated from the moho, such as the PS convergence, the PPPS multiples, or 2P reflections. And if we compare the results for these two stations on the left to the one on the right, the moho generated phases seems to have relatively later arrivals for the down deep station and relatively earlier arrivals for the up deep station. And that information is consistent with the crustal images on the left. And therefore, we conclude it is the arc wall dipping moho is observed beneath Timor Island. And with this, we can further determine that the fossil materials below this boundary are part of the lithospheric mantle for the downgoing plate. Accordingly, we can extend this discontinuity knowledge on the vertical profiles like this. And now it is clearly present the subducted Australian continent margin beneath Timor and the southern part of South Sea with its crust, dipping moho, and the lithospheric mantle components. And let's come to our first main conclusion is that we observe new seismic structure evidence showing the subduction of the Australian continent margin beneath Timor and part of the South Sea. Besides the first order structure features, if we draw more vertical profiles across the inner to outer arcs, we can also observe very beautiful along strike structural variations as indicated by these four vertical images on the right. And combining with other evidence, we interpret such progressive structure changes might reflect different collisional stages as a result of the oblique convergence. So far, our focus is mainly concentrated in the eastern part, where the across arc structuration appear to be dominant. And next, I will include the structure features in the west and focus on some secondary small scale structure features along the orogenic strike. First, I would like to simply review the incoming Australian margin configuration that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. In the plot on the right, a jiggered edge ocean continent boundary is present along the Western Australian. And in the margin parallel direction, the configuration alternative alternate between the oceanic crust and offshore plateau. And then for the plots on the left, it is a zoom-in structure of the Exmouth Plateau, and in the margin perpendicular direction from west to east, it transfers from oceanic to volcanic margin and then to the continental compositions. Now let's look at our crustal images at 25, 30, 35, and 45 kilometers. Obviously, we can observe structural variations along the strike of outer arcs at different scales. For example, Sunda here is characterized by high velocity that is different from the slow materials dominant Timor Islands. And there is also secondary high velocity anomaly appears in the center Timor at depths of deeper than 30 kilometers, which are different with the slow materials on its western and eastern end. If we place our crustal image with the jiggered edge ocean continent boundary presents offshore in Western Australian together, we found that the along strike anomalies resolved in our model have a very similar geometry to the structure of the Western Australian margin. And together with previously geochemistry evidence and new uplift of observations, we interpret that these observed along strike structure anomalies across the entire outer arcs at depths reflect possible secondary small-scale inherited structural heterogeneities of the incoming Australian plate. And next, we further examine the structural features in both margin parallel and perpendicular direction on some vertical profiles. Here in the plots on the right, we observe an alternate appearance of slow and fast materials, and it seems they correspond to those small-scale structural heterogeneities of the incoming Australian plate along both margin parallel and perpendicular direction quite well. Therefore, based on such consistency, we conclude that the tectonic evolution of our study region is probably defined by inherited structure of the Gondwana rifted continental margin of the incoming plate. That's all the materials that I want to cover in this talk. In the end, I would like to summarize my talk with these two takeaway messages. First, we found new seismic structure evidence that supports the subduction of Australian continental margin. Secondly, the secondary small-scale crustal structures are probably related to the oblique plate convergence. Meanwhile, they may also affected by the incoming plate's structural heterogeneity. There are still many works that need to be done to eventually determine which effects are dominant. And I hope that I will find some answers by the completion of my PhD. The majority of this talk is accepted for publication recently, and you are very welcome to send me an email if you have any questions or comments. That's all. Thanks for reviewing.